All right, and we're speaking with Charles Kupchan. He's a Madison native, professor of international affairs at Georgetown University, and has served on the National Security Council and in the U.S. Department of State. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I first wanted to ask, is it usual for a Secretary of State to deliver an address like this?
It's not that unusual for a Secretary of State to talk about U.S. policy toward China. It's very unusual for a Secretary of State to do so in the home stretch of an election in a swing state. In general, the Secretary of the State, National Security Council officials, they stay out of domestic politics. They're supposed to be nonpartisan representatives of the state. I recall when I was working in the White House in 2016, I regularly got emails from our ethics office telling me to steer clear of any political activity, couldn't talk to people from either campaign. And in general, that's the rule. Those are the guardrails. This Secretary of State participated in the Republican convention. Now he has come to Wisconsin just a few weeks before the November election. It's definitely out of the norm when it comes to the rules for behavior in an election season.
So, to your memory, has something like this speech happened before?
I can't say that it's never happened, that a Secretary of State has never gone on a campaign tour. I can tell you that it is highly unusual and that it does breach the guardrails that most people in Washington believe should be adhered to in terms of separating foreign policy, diplomacy, the national interest from partisan politics.
So when I think of the kind of dual federalism that we have, you have the federal government and you have the state government. I was wondering if you could kind of describe what relationship the state government might have in some of these foreign policy issues, especially as we saw today talking about China.
Well, people of Wisconsin have direct interest in relations with China in the sense that the U.S. and the Wisconsin economy are tied up with the Chinese economy, a lot of trade going back and forth. Secretary Pompeo was right to say that the Chinese are kind of leaning in to American politics. But I have to say, if I were a Wisconsinite or going back to my origins as a cheesehead, I would not necessarily want to hear a speech about China and interference in the American political system right now. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Over 1,000 people of Wisconsin have died. I think if Pompeo came to Wisconsin, he should have showed up with masks. He should have showed up with equipment to help protect the people of the state. This is what is on the minds of Americans. Yes, I guess he wants to kind of divert attention to the Chinese, call it a Wuhan virus, but there'll be plenty of time for finger pointing. I think right now the key is to do whatever we can to get the pandemic under control in the United States and to work with whatever partners we can abroad to make sure that the pandemic doesn't get worse and push the global economy into worse shape. I didn't hear anything about that. All I heard was him wanting to blame China. And my own read on that is that as the Trump administration has dropped the ball on the COVID-19 crisis, they're trying to say, oh, this is all China's fault. Well, maybe the virus did come from China, but the United States has really, I think, distinguished itself for one of the poorest responses to the pandemic.
So I'll also ask too, as we see this foreign policy speech coming during the 2020 election, what does that signal to some of our allies and adversaries abroad?
Well, foreign policy is an important part of any presidential election, and it's fitting for the Secretary of State to outline U.S. thinking on China. But the fact that that is being done in Wisconsin right before a presidential election sends a signal to allies abroad that the United States is playing politics with foreign policy, that the Secretary of State is trying to, in some ways, intermix the conduct of statecraft with partisanship. And that doesn't look too good abroad. And that's especially true at a time when America's reputation overseas is hitting new lows. Part of it comes from America First and President Trump's desire for the United States to back away from international teamwork. And part of it comes from, I think, the hit we have taken as others watch the bungled response to the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, the US has generally had a reputation for being competent, for getting things right, for knowing how to handle problems and addressing them in a pragmatic way. Well, for the rest of the world, they're looking at the United States, a country that really hasn't got its arms around the pandemic, a president who started off by saying, hey, this is just going to go away. And they're wondering, you know, what has happened? Here's a country that we've always looked up to. Here's a country that we wanted to emulate. Now they look at us and they wonder what's befallen the United States. And I fear that what happened today, Secretary of State giving a speech in a state house in a swing state right before the election, it just kind of reconfirms the image that the United States under this administration has lost its way.
So this comes the same week that we had Attorney General Bill Barr in Milwaukee, and I was wondering how some of those interactions between cabinet level officials and state and local government officials happen. Is it more kind of these informal meetings? Is it more some of these addresses? I was just wondering kind of from your experience what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's unusual about what happened today and the attention of cabinet level officials in Wisconsin and other swing states is that this is taking place in the middle of an election season. It's fine for there to be good, strong discussions and ties between cabinet level officials and local officials, municipal officials, state officials. That's the way the American system works. That's how federalism works. But I do think that there is a norm of trying to keep partisan politics out of federal affairs that is being breached here. And so, yes, the president, the vice president, they're running for re-election. They should be making campaign stops. But when it comes to someone like Secretary Pompeo, this is a speech that should have been given at the United Nations. After all, the General Assembly is taking place as we speak. Or it's a speech that could have been given from the State Department. It's fine to talk about Chinese affairs. But I do think it's inappropriate and odd for a sitting Secretary of State to come to a swing state, as I said, in the middle of the election season.
And you kind of touched on it, talking about the virus, but I wanted to ask too, is there anything that's kind of stuck out from the speech to you? Anything that surprised you?
You know, in some ways, I thought the biggest surprise for me was what wasn't said. And two things come to mind. One was more about the virus, more about the pandemic, more about what the Trump administration is doing to control the problem. We're seeing high rates of infection in Wisconsin. We're seeing concern about the university, about Big Ten football. I would like to hear more about how the Trump administration is making sure that matters aren't going to get worse in the weeks ahead. I heard nothing about that. The other thing I thought was missing was mention of Russia. If you want to talk about a country that is interfering in American domestic politics, you want to start by talking about Russia and the Kremlin. Going back to the 2016 election, continuing through the midterms, continuing to today. And so, yes, we do have evidence that the Chinese have been trying to intervene and shape the American debate. We heard at the beginning of the secretary's speech that a Chinese diplomat reached out to the Wisconsin State House to try to pass a resolution. So yeah, they're in the game, but the biggest offender is Russia. No real discussion of that issue, but that is in keeping with the Trump administration's general discomfort with talking about Russia. The president wants to have a strong relationship with Mr. Putin, and in many respects, talking about Russian interference in American affairs for those at the top, for the president, for Secretary Pompeo, for the national security advisor. They don't say anything because in some ways it's a taboo topic for the president.